Today, before I explain what we're considering today, I want to acknowledge some guests in the room here today. Georgetown Law School Federal Legislation Clinic fellows are here. We're happy to see them. And some of the people who are with them, you may recall, although it's hard to tell with our masks on, but Dave Rapallo and Courtney French from the Oversight Committee, regular, Jessica Killen from Donna Shalala's office, and if I missed anybody, I'm sorry, but anyway, we're happy to have you here. And today we're going to be considering three bills. First is H.R. 3992. This bill complements bipartisan legislation passed earlier this Congress. It will ensure older Americans are not excluded from applying for work or pushed out of the workforce. This is at a time when 1 in 4 adults ages 65 and older are a part of the workforce today. Second bill is H.R. 3110. This is bipartisan, bicameral legislation to extend protections for nursing mothers in the workplace. By closing the coverage gap, it protects nearly 9 million employees, including teachers, agricultural workers, and transportation workers. Third is H.R. 2119. This legislation is urgently needed to combat intimate partner violence and provide victims with the resources they need. I'm proud that it includes a focus on underserved populations, including communities of color, tribal communities, LGBTQ+ individuals, and people with disabilities. While the rates of serious intimate partner violence have thankfully decreased since the mid-1990s, the coronavirus pandemic has only increased the risk of abuse, and it has disrupted many of the services survivors rely on. So there's a lot of bipartisan agreement on these bills, and it is my hope that we can come together and make them a reality. And now let me turn to our ranking member for any comments that he wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our hearing today covers 3 items from the Education and Labor Committee. If there's a common theme today, it's that each sounds reasonable on its face, but deeper dive reveals some troubling issues. I wish my friends in the majority had rethought each of these items, and I'm disappointed that so many Republican amendments proposed to fix these issues were reflexively rejected without even considering their merits. However, I remain hopeful the entire House can do better. The first item I'll discuss, H.R. 3992, the Protect Older Applicants Act, adds the term, quote, applicants for employment, unquote, to the list of protected individuals covered by the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. While this sounds worthwhile, it's ultimately misguided and unnecessary. Applicants for employment are already covered by the ADEA, so this effort is at best duplicative. At worst, it could inadvertently make common recruiting tools like internship programs or job fairs at colleges and universities illegal. Certainly, additional protections must be incorporated into this bill before seeking to advance it to the President's desk. The second item I'll discuss is H.R. 3110, the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act. This bill expands current protections for nursing mothers in the workforce. That sounds like a worthy goal, but digging deeper reveals some cause for concern. A one-size-fits-all system that treats flight attendants the same as employees in executive, administrative, or professional roles is absurd. Unlike existing law, H.R. 3110 also creates confusion over whether compensation is owed to employees utilizing the protections of this bill and would impose the greatest cost on small businesses, those least able to bear them. As for our first item, as with our first item, I would urge my friends in the majority to rethink this course before moving the bill to the floor. Finally, the remaining item is H.R. 2119, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Improvement Act. I understand Republicans on the Education and Labor Committee have concerns with this bill, as with the other two. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, Mr. Chairman, particularly Mr. Wahlberg, who will discuss these and other concerns he and his fellow Education and Labor Committee Republicans have with these bills. With that, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. Ranking Member Cole yields back. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 2119, the Family Violence Prevention and Service Improvement Act of 2021, H.R. 3992, the Protect Older Job Applicants Act, and H.R. 3110, the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act. Chairman Scott and Representative Wahlberg, we are delighted that you are here. And I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Chairman Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cole, other members of the committee. I'm pleased to speak in support of the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act, the Protect Older Job Applicants Act, and the Family Violence Prevention and Services Improvement Act of 2021. First bill, the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act, expands critical workplace protections for nursing mothers. More than a decade ago, Congress passed legislation that required employers to provide eligible nursing employees with a private space and break time to pump. Unfortunately, gaps in the law exclude millions of workers and limited how workers can seek redress in court when employers violate their rights. For nursing workers, these protections are necessary to balance work, their health, and the health of their babies. They can even be more important now as parents, particularly mothers attempting to re-enter the workforce after millions of workers were forced to leave their jobs during the pandemic. The Bipartisan, Bicameral Pump for Nursing Mothers Act expands existing protections for nursing mothers to nearly 9 million additional employees who are currently left out. And it ensures that nursing workers have access to appropriate remedies when their employers fail to provide break time and appropriate pumping space. I want to thank Ms. Maloney and Ms. Hera Butler for their leadership on this legislation. And Mr. Chairman, I ask that my manager's amendment be ruled in order. It's my understanding that the bipartisan leadership of the bill approves of that amendment. The second bill, the Protect Older Job Applicants Act, introduced by Ms. Garcia of Texas, helps protect older job applicants against age discrimination. In June, Democrats and Republicans came together to pass the Protect Older Workers Against Discrimination Act. This bill would restore evidentiary standards for older workers who allege age discrimination in disparate impact treatment claims under the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, or ADEA. Regrettably, we're unable to include an amendment from Ms. Garcia which clarified that the ADEA includes job applicants in the ability to bring disparate impact claims, because the amendment for some reason was deemed not germane. Yet for decades, the ADEA has protected job applicants who are denied employment opportunities due to their age. Unfortunately, recent court decisions in some parts of the country have cut off these protections for job applicants bringing disparate impact claims. To address this gap, the Education and Labor Committee marked up Ms. Garcia's amendment as a standalone bill, which is before us today. Older workers should have equal access to civil rights protections, regardless of whether they're looking for a job or already have one. The Protect Older Job Applicants Act will ensure that we protect both job applicants and older Americans who are already employed. Finally, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Improvement Act of 2021. Since 1984, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act has been a central pillar in our fight against intimate partner violence. Today, the law authorizes critical services, including shelters, supportive services for survivors, and 24-hour domestic violence hotlines. Regrettably, these programs have expired since these programs have been expired since the end of 2015, hindering our ability to meet the changing needs of our communities. The pandemic has only increased the risk of intimate partner violence and exacerbated the gaps in our response. 2119 reauthorizes the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, and it targets and expands funding to reach communities with disproportionately high rates of intimate partner violence and limited access to services, and it invests in preventing violence before it happens so we can avoid the physical danger and emotional trauma that survivors often experience. I want to thank Ms. McBath from Georgia, Mr. Young from Alaska, Ms. Moore from Wisconsin, and Mr. Katko from New York for working together on this key bipartisan priority. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And now we'll yield to Mr. Wahlberg.
Standing in for Representative Fox is an honor to do today, and also with greetings to my friend and chairman, Representative Scott. I want to say thank you to you, Chairman, and Ranking Member Cole for the opportunity to speak in opposition to 3 irresponsible bills. Not bills that we would say don't have some merit, but have gone the wrong direction. H.R. 3110, the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act, H.R. 3992, the Protect Older Job Applicants Act, and H.R. 2119, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Improvement Act. Nursing mothers, older workers, and victims of family and intimate partner violence deserve protections under the law to support them in their unique challenges. But each of these bills is burdensome, restrictive, and counterproductive. I'll start with the Pump for Nursing Mothers Act. More than 2 million women left the labor force in 2010. Now more than ever, we need to advocate for flexible workplace policies that improve conditions for and empower working mothers. H.R. 3110 revolves around a false premise that all working mothers' needs are the same. Mothers working in a wide variety of workplaces would face the same one-size-fits-all requirements. Working mothers deserve proper accommodations to nurse in a clean and safe environment without fear of losing their job. But failing to account for workplace-specific variabilities and needs, as this bill does, is not the way to help women. In addition, this legislation takes a sweeping and punitive approach to remedying alleged violations, creating extra hurdles and inappropriate penalties for employers and obvious incentives for trial lawyers to line their own pockets with frivolous lawsuits. The Republican solution, H.R. 4297, a bill sponsored by Representative Miller Meeks and submitted as an amendment to this committee, includes workable and common sense alterations to the Fair Labor Standards Act's break time accommodation, including additional coverage for nursing mothers in a manner that is responsive to industry-specific needs, while providing necessary protections for employers and imposing appropriate penalties on non-compliant employers. I urge the committee to allow this amendment to be debated and voted on by the House. Democrats habitually market their trial lawyer payoffs as wins for vulnerable Americans, as seen yet again with the so-called Protect Older Job Applicants Act. H.R. 3992 greatly expands liability under the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, ADAA, by authorizing age discrimination claims by job applicants under a disparate impact theory. The bill will needlessly and recklessly interfere with routine recruitment and hiring practices while 8.4 million Americans are unemployed, and employers are scrambling to fill 10.9 million job openings. Simply posting a job on LinkedIn or recruiting at a college fair will be threatened, as the bill provides a breeding ground for trial lawyers to claim age discrimination, as many younger workers tend to participate in these forums. Not only is the bill unworkable, but it is entirely unnecessary. Older workers are faring well in the workplace. Employment for workers aged 65 and older tripled over the last 30 years, and the committee failed to hold even one hearing on the bill before it was considered. Democrats are again throwing facts and congressional precedent to the wind to appease trial lawyers and the left wing of their party. I urge that we reject this superfluous bill and continue to uphold protections for older workers as required by ADEA. Republicans offered amendments at the committee markup to protect job opportunities for workers and determine whether the bill is necessary, but all were defeated on party line votes. I'll briefly describe these amendments, which have also been submitted to the Rules Committee. Representative Miller Meeks offered an amendment to make sure the bill does not prohibit an employer from recruiting or interviewing students attending high schools, job corps centers, or colleges or universities. Representative Allen offered an amendment to ensure the bill does not prohibit employers from operating apprenticeship or internship programs. Representative Letlow offered an amendment to protect employers' ability to post job openings on job search websites. And Representative Keller offered an amendment that the Government Accountability Office study whether not allowing disparate impact discrimination claims by job applicants under the ADAA has a significant negative impact on these applicants. Finally, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Improvement Act is another problematic and misleading bill. Since 1984, Congress has worked in a bipartisan manner to reauthorize this bill, which helps protect families against violence and supports survivors through recovery. Sadly, Democrats are now using it as a vehicle to push left-wing priorities. FVPSA is not an instrument for partisan policies, especially those that threaten religious liberties. At the behest of special interest groups, H.R. 2119 paves the way for taxpayer-supported abortions. Forcing the public to pay for abortions is morally repugnant and should not be allowed to stand in this bill or any bill. The Republican substitute amendment improves current law, ensuring that funds are focused on life-saving supportive services. Mr. Chairman, for these reasons and many more, I urge you to make and order all the Republican amendments which will prevent Democrats from capitalizing on vulnerable Americans to further a left-wing agenda. And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to say that I don't think it's a trial lawyer payoff to make sure that a breastfeeding mom can do so safely, or to ensure that older workers are not discriminated against in the workplace. These are bipartisan bills, despite what the gentleman said about them being partisan. There are Republicans who support these bills as well, and I hope they get a strong bipartisan support on the floor. But before I yield to Mr. Cole, without objection, I'd like to insert into the record statements of the administration policy in support of H.R. 3110, H.R. 3992, and H.R. 2119. And I now yield to the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And just let me make the opening point. I think these bills will get some bipartisan support. I think we can make them better here, though. And I think that's what our members on the Education and Labor Committee were trying to do. Mr. Wahlberg, let me start particularly focus on a couple of the amendments to H.R. 3110 to ask you about. First, the manager's amendment from Chairman Scott seems, and Chairman Scott, if you want to comment on it, I'd be delighted to hear your comment as well. It seems to address one of the concerns you had with the underlying bill, which was that it creates a one-size-fits-all regulatory scheme that's just unworkable. Do you think the amendment adequately addresses the concerns about the workability that you raised, or that the committee Republicans raised during the legislative discussion?
Thank you, Mr. Cole, and I would associate my comments with yours about we hope that we could make something work out of these three bills. But I do not think that that amendment adequately addresses the concern. As I previously stated, H.R. 3110 is overly broad and imposes unworkable and unnecessary burdens on employers. The bill imposes one-size-fits-all treatment of disparate businesses and industries without providing feasible compliance options. The manager's amendment acknowledges this problem in the underlying bill. Unfortunately, the aviation-related provisions in the manager's amendment do not effectively address the legitimate concern of airline industry regarding the safety and security of passengers and flight crews. To address this and other flaws in H.R. 3110, Representative Miller Meeks has a common-sense amendment which expands access to these accommodations but implements them in a responsible, feasible, and fair manner. I urge the committee to make it in order.
Let me ask you about a second amendment, if I may. It's a bipartisan amendment filed by Ms. Herrera Butler and Ms. Maloney, which would maintain the current hardship exemption for companies with fewer than 50 employees as opposed to the 25 employees included in the bill. Do you support that amendment being made in order, and does it adequately address some of your other concerns in the bill?
Thanks for the question. I do support this bipartisan amendment to correct the damaging provisions added by committee Democrats, but it does not address other critical flaws in the underlying bill impacting businesses. H.R. 3110 will impose new and excessive penalties for minor or technical violations of the FLSA's nursing accommodation requirement. These unreasonable penalties, combined with compliance challenging resulting from this complex mandate, will lead to a proliferation of costly and protracted lawsuits. The result will be delayed accommodation for workers.
Okay, let me move now to H.R. 3992, and I think we can all agree that any sort of discrimination, frankly, has no place in our society. But I want to focus on some of the implications of the legislation today. First, what's the problem the majority is trying to solve here? Is there evidence of systemic discrimination against older job applicants which would support passing the legislation before us today?
Thank you for the question. There is no evidence of systemic discrimination against older job applicants. In fact, quite the opposite. Older job applicants have been faring very well in recent decades. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, for workers age 65 and older, employment tripled from 1988 to 2018, while employment among younger workers only grew by about 1/3. Among people aged 75 and older, the number of employed people nearly quadrupled, increasing from 461,000 in 1988 to 1.8 million in 2018. Democrats, I don't believe, have shown a need for H.R. 3992.
And finally, it seems to me legislation before us is written so broadly that regardless of one's intention to discriminate, companies could be sued by job applicants for discrimination solely because the company attended a high school job fair. Is that actually correct? Is that a legitimate concern we should have about these bills?
That's correct. It's a legitimate concern. Under H.R. 3992, recruiting programs at high schools, Job Corps centers, and colleges, including job fairs, would be legally suspect because these students are younger on average. Even some veterans' job fairs could be. This is not mere speculation. AARP has already backed class action litigation challenging college recruitment by an employer as violating the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. In addition, under the bill, apprenticeship and internship programs could be challenged because the participants in these programs are very often younger, and employers frequently hire full-time employees from these programs. Even the ability of employers to post on-job search websites and online job boards will be threatened under H.R. 3992 because the users of these websites are younger generally on average. This bill is really unnecessary and ill-advised.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Torres.
I just want to say that I fully support these bills, and I'm so excited to finally be treating women who are nursing their children in a humane and fair way. I remember being a young mother and having to pump in the public restroom of my workplace. It is simply unacceptable, and if we truly care about quality of life for women and children and infants, this is one way. As it relates to older Americans, it's about time that we take seriously the issue of discrimination in older job applicants as well as workers. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Mr. Chairman,
Chairman Scott.
if the gentlelady from California would allow me to speak on her time very briefly, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I forgot to pipe up. The ranking member asked me if I wanted to speak on in response to the questions. I couldn't get it off of mute quickly enough. But I did want to respond to some of the things that the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, said. First of all, the moving the threshold from back up to 25 that's in the bipartisan amendment is also incorporated in the manager's amendment. So that amendment would not be necessary if the manager's amendment is adopted. The second point is whether or not there is age discrimination. I seek to enter into the record a 2017 Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco study that found the callback rate for was higher for younger applicants and lower for older applicants, consistent with discrimination in hiring, when they sent a lot of resumes responding to job openings in 12 cities, totaling 40,000. They saw a clear pattern. And finally, whether or not the disparate impact ought to be allowed for job applicants with all the kinds of scenarios that were mentioned. I just want to point out that the disparate impact is present law in all but 2 of the circuits, appellate court circuits, so that only in 2 circuits would this be making a change. All the other circuits would just confirming present law. There's a split in the circuits. I think it would be helpful to everybody if we had the same law throughout the country. I thank you, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
All right, the gentlelady yields back. I now go to Mr. Rushenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I would associate my remarks with the ranking member, and he covered all the material I wanted to cover. So I'll yield to Mr. Wahlberg and see if there's anything in addition you would like to add. If not, I will yield back.
I appreciate that, but I think I'll wait for further questions. We've made our statement, and I'm sure the Rules Committee has had plenty of hours spent in those saddles over the course of the past week.
Sounds good. I'll yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you're nice to do that. You know, our former colleague, the late Mo Udall, used to have a line when people would say the same thing over and over again. He'd say, everything that possibly can be said has been said, but not everybody has said it. So he'd go into it. Yeah. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to welcome my classmate and friend, Mr. Wahlberg, to our committee. I want to welcome the law school class and Ms. Killen to this committee. I can tell you most law students in America have no idea what the Rules Committee is, nor have ever been able to find this room and participate in a hearing. But our job, and I'm sure you know, is to really be the traffic cops for bills of any size or controversy that come to the floor of the House. We determine what amendments are in order as Mr. Wahlberg is presenting these amendments, and what are going to be the terms of debate on these 3, really what are civil rights bills, dealing with women's rights, older Americans' rights, and stopping abuse within domestic situations. So obviously, as Mr. Cole said, all of these are bipartisan pieces of legislation, and the question is, how should they be fine-tuned by the amendment? So I do have a question, Mr. Wahlberg, and for the chairman, on the Miller-Meeks amendment concerning job fairs. So, Mr. Wahlberg, you were complaining about trial lawyers who, in my opinion, are doing the work of individuals to make sure that their civil rights are upheld. But the concern that's been raised, I think, is a fair one. I'm not sure, I think the amendment doesn't do what it intends to do, which is the one that might make sure it can go forward with job fairs. So if you could talk to me about that amendment a little bit more, because in my reading of it, it goes farther than is necessary and would potentially pave the way for discrimination against older Americans. And now that I've hit that 65 mark, I know that Americans generally are healthier, stronger, smart at any age these days. And, you know, I don't want to see older Americans put at a disadvantage. So why do you think that that amendment helps? Because I think it hurts the bill.
Well, I'm glad I'm talking to a young man like you, and thanks for the question. I've hit moving towards 71 right now, but I'm strong and vital. I think the key is that we want to make sure that the unintended consequences of providing job fairs that certainly show up on campuses, high schools, job corps situations where normally seniors wouldn't be, but employers need to go. Not that they don't want to have workers who are older, myself included, that are capable of doing the work and want to do the work and want to come to the job site second day, third day, fourth day, and continue on. But they want to have as expanded opportunity as possible to be in front of people that could fill those needs. And we know right now, looking back in my own state of Michigan, there are hiring signs out everywhere and the inability to get people. And so this is just another opportunity to say, let's not close it off and put a situation where there will be unnecessary lawsuits. If there's a necessary lawsuit, I would agree with you. Trial lawyers can provide the service necessary to make sure that we care for the needs of seniors as well as everybody else. But let's also make it possible for well-meaning, purpose-intended employers to fill their job needs by going to as many expanded places as possible and not worry about the fact if I go into a setting that is primarily populated by younger people, that I'm not going to be sued.
Okay, and I'd like to turn to the chairman, see if he has any thoughts on that amendment.
Well, the reality is that all of these things that are speculative that they're talking about, the present law in all but 2 circuits allows disparate impact claims. So if they can point to something that's actually happening, then we could have a discussion, but just making stuff up doesn't add to the discussion.
Okay. All right, thank you. I yield back to the chair.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I'd like to associate myself with the comments of Ranking Member Cole and of Representative Wahlberg. And I will just say you covered most of the what I was concerned about, but I did want to, and I think Representative Wahlberg, you mentioned it a little bit, but the issue of tailoring and the flexibility to different industries, I think that might be covered in the one of the Miller-Meeks's amendments, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because that is a concern. You know, if you think of some of the airline industry or of agriculture, there are so many things out there, and wanted to make sure that there was some flexibility and potentially that exemption. I believe you mentioned there was a Republican or a bipartisan amendment that was offered that provided the 50 employee exemption. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, because that is probably where my biggest concern lies.
Well, the 50 employee amendment is a bipartisan amendment. Herrera Butler and Carolyn Maloney put that together to make sure that there was a little more flexibility, and we bumped it up to 50 employees from the 25. On the issue of the Job Corps, student recruiting, colleges, universities, all of that, Miller-Meeks offered an amendment to make sure that there is not a prohibition, intended or otherwise, that employers cross the line and are sued for age discrimination if they attend a job fair on one of these sites that generally would have younger people showing up. And that could include even a veterans jobs fair, because I know that veterans fairs that I held before the pandemic and hope to hold again soon were primarily frequented by people that were not seniors. Though there were seniors, veterans, but very few. The majority were, again, veterans just coming out of the service or who had been out a few years.
And just maybe talk a little bit about the industry flexibility issue, the airline, and maybe I got the amendment wrong. Maybe it wasn't a Miller-Meeks amendment, but I thought there was something that was discussed regarding the flexibility of, so that different industries were able to.
That's the Pump Act that it's referring to with the aviation flexibility, to make sure that flight crew and others were protected in a circumstance that is very much different than most job sites would even be. I have a daughter right now that may, in fact, at this moment, being pumping, most likely because it's a big part of her life right now with a newborn. But a flight crew, aviation setting is significantly unique, whether it's at 37,000 feet or whether it's in the process of being in an airport and transversing airport situations.
Was there ranking, I guess not ranking member, I'm sorry, Representative Wahlberg, was that addressed in any of the amendments to the Pump Act? And because, and I mentioned agriculture earlier, you mentioned the airline industry, but you also have agriculture, a whole bunch of different fields that women are working in now, and I want to make sure that the industries and the companies have some kind of flexibility to work with the woman to make sure that that it works out.
And that was addressed in amendments we offered during the course of the hearings.
Okay, all right, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of the gentlemen for their testimony. Chairman Scott, thank you for the work on these bills, especially the Pump Act, which I know is important to a lot of my constituents. I wonder if you would say a word not just about the equal rights implications of this legislation and the convenience implications, but also the health implications of the Pump Act. I wonder if you would just say a word about the importance of nursing for the development of healthy babies and children.
Well, I think the health aspects are well known that this is something that's critical to the health of the child. The fact that the mother wants to nurse is an indication that the mothers are recognizing that the pumped milk is a lot healthier than stuff that you can buy off the shelf. There mention was made of airline crews. The manager's amendment makes it clear that airline employees are covered even during flight, but not during the critical takeoff, landing, or other critical times during the flight. The flight crew does not have to be given, which is generally given to other employees, total time off during while they're pumping. But there is and they will be available if an emergency occurs. I mean, you have restroom breaks. I mean, there's sometimes you could get from pumping and onto the scene of whatever the emergency is as quickly as you can get out of the bathroom. It goes into great lengths to make sure that there are no safety concerns. It delays because of the regulatory back and forth with the FAA and safety regulations. Airline employees, the provisions of the bill do not apply to airlines employees for a year to make sure that there's ample time to get the regulations straight and make sure they're consistent with the FAA safety regulations. But there's no question about the health implications of being able to pump. Those are well known.
Well, but I appreciate that, and I thank you and the Labor and Education Committee for hard work on this significantly bipartisan legislation.
Thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to say that these conversations about trying to nurse or pump in an airport are bringing back some of my worst nightmares as a young mother. Like Ms. Torres, there was the experience of trying to find a way to nurse or pump when you have a small child and you've been told that that's the best way to keep your child healthy. So I vehemently support that act. I did want to ask Chairman Scott a couple questions about the Family Violence Prevention and Services Improvement Act. One of my predecessors, Bob Edgar, who used to represent the 7th District of Pennsylvania, also was a Methodist minister, and he started the first shelter for women and children in Philadelphia. And that, in fact, was my first legal services job, was helping represent women and children at that facility. And it was so important because up until that time, there was no place for women and children to go, as frequently they had to find new housing because of domestic abuse. So how will this bill help improve services for women and children in domestic violence situations? This is for Chairman Scott.
There are many provisions. Basically, it puts a lot more money into prevention, but it targets and expands funding to reach communities with disproportionately high rates of intimate partner violence and limited services, so that those in those areas can get services. As you've indicated, the program has worked well over the years. It hadn't been reauthorized for a long time, and we need to make sure that the services continue and that more money is put into prevention so we don't have the problems to begin with.
Thank you. Yeah, this act, along with VAWA, it's just head scratching why they haven't been reauthorized again. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Scott. I also want to welcome Jessica back and her team. She used to be neighbors of mine over in Longworth with Secretary Shalala's office, so it's always great to see them, to see all the students, and hope you enjoyed this experience. I was going to ask, I'd completely forgotten what mask I was wearing. I was going to ask Mr. Perlmutter to remind me, but I see it on the screen, so I guess I don't have to ask
and the
about it.
Cardinals have won 16 games in a row.
Oh, yeah. It's been so long since they lost, I'd completely forgotten. But neither here nor there. I do want to thank Mr. Scott. I have the privilege of serving on the Education and Labor Committee. And through hearings on these bills and all of the conversation, and always appreciate Mr. Wahlberg and his thoughts. But I just want to thank the committee for advancing these. I'm proud to support these bills. I'll support the rule and the underlying legislation. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. DeSaulnier.
I have nothing to add, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to associate myself with the comments that that have been shared before on why we need all of these bills. But I do want to take a couple extra minutes on the Pump Act to talk about how important it is for my home state of North Carolina. The Pump Act is critical to ensuring mental and physical health of mothers and their infants and promoting our economy. North Carolina is one of only 4 states in the country with no state law protecting breastfeeding employees. This bill would provide a reasonable break time for breastfeeding mothers, require that workplaces offer proper facilities for breastfeeding, and codify a private right of action to seek relief for violations of those protections. It's critical that we work to make these protections a reality for working mothers in states like North Carolina that are not guaranteed adequate breastfeeding accommodations in the workplace. The retention of working mothers remains an issue. 47% of new moms cite breastfeeding as one of the biggest challenges to returning to the workplace. In just the last year, the Department of Labor investigated 6 businesses in North Carolina for violations of breastfeeding rights under the Fair Labor Standards Act. In my district, a working mother was given a storage room without air conditioning and an electrical outlet to pump. Another mother had to pump in a fellow employee's office with that employee present. In North Carolina, it's easier to take a smoking break than it is for a mother to take a pump break. This is simply unacceptable. Also under consideration is an amendment I offered which would help ensure women have sufficient notice of the new protections afforded in this bill, particularly in states like North Carolina. It would make eligible persons aware of the updated statute, provide them with informational resources, and thus would reduce the likelihood of employer defection from this legislation. This is a gender equity issue, a labor rights issue, an economic justice issue, and it demands our attention. I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment, the rule, and the underlying bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else on the panel wish to ask these witnesses questions? Hearing none, Mr. Chairman Scott, thank you. Mr. Wahlberg, thank you very much. You're free to go. And without objection, I would like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement from Representative Strickland in support of their amendment. All right, anyone else wish to testify on any of these bills, HR 2119, HR 3992, or HR 3110? Don't hear anybody? Okay, I don't see anybody. So this closes the hearing on HR 2119, HR 3992, and HR 3110. And so, before I recess subject to the call of the chair, as you all know, that this is an interesting week. Lots to do. Not sure how or when, but it will all work out and it'll all be great. And so when I recess, we probably will not come back today, but if that should change, I'll give you plenty of notice. But as soon as I know anything, I will call you.
Well, could I ask a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
Along those lines? I may not, obviously, at some point, it appears we'll be considering the reconciliation bill. Do you have any idea yet, Mr. Chairman? You may not. I'm just trying to find out kind of how you see things shaping up, when we will consider different things.
So the answer to that is I do not know.
Okay, that's fair.
If you asked me last Friday, I might have given you a different answer than today. So
let me ask
good
you
thing
this.
didn't
I
ask me.
mean, from what we read, there could be a considerable rewrite of the reconciliation bill in this committee, which is, we have the power to do that. You have the power.
We are the powerful Rules Committee.
We are a powerful Rules Committee. Well, it's a lot more powerful if you're part of the 9 than the 4, let me tell you. But, you have the power to bring us back within an hour. And what I'd like to know, are we going to get more time than that, particularly on something as massive as the reconciliation? But if we get a major rewrite, we would normally under bill, we'd have 72 hours to look at it. And this is rumored to be, it depends on whose calculation, but a 4.3 trillion, a 3.5 trillion, it's a lot of money. It'll be the biggest bill, I think Congress has probably ever considered in terms of dollar amount. So we'd like to see if you can give us some idea about how much time, assuming there is a major rewrite, we would have to go through that.
Well, I would like a $6.5 trillion bill, but we're not going to get that.
I'm delighted to hear that, Mr. Chairman.
But look, I can't, I'm going to pass your concerns on to all those who are trying to determine what the schedule is going to be. But I do think that we want to make sure that we can accommodate you as best we can. So let me get back to you on that. But I understand the need for time, especially if there's a major rewrite. And I would say to the gentleman, I think not only he would like to, be able to digest the details, but so would people on our side as well.
I'm sure that's true. So again, whatever you can do to give us as much time, a situation like that, the normal time for something like that would be 72 hours. I'm not asking you, but just please stretch it as much as you can, just because it's, again, if it's as major as it's purported to be, then it's going to take us a while, and your own members, as you point out, a while to get through it and be able to cast an intelligent vote on it. So with that, I appreciate your assurance and look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you all very much. And without objection, the committee stands in recess subject to the call of the chair.